Hello, welcome to Today in Bad Theology. Today we ask if there's bad theology in a tweet by Nadia Bolz-Weber. Well, hello again, welcome to Today in Bad Theology. We ask the question, is this tweet by the ELCA's first called as a public theologian, Reverend Nadia Bolz-Weber, bad theology? Now, in case you missed this tweet, I'll show it here on the screen for you. This is a screen grab that I got from the Twitter here, but here we go. Pope Pius XI established Christ the King Sunday in 1925 to counter what he regarded as the destructive forces of fascism and the totalitarian claims of Nazi ideologies. I know I'm 4 days early, but happy Antifa Sunday, everyone. Now, this tweet created a great deal of conversation, which was probably what it was designed to do, right? That's what Bolz-Weber does, is she generates conversation. But was it good theology in what she did? I think we need to look closely at this. Usually on this program here, if something is bad theology, it's hurting someone. So we have to ask, who is being hurt? Is somebody being hurt by this? That's kind of the threshold for bad. There's another category of theology that I used the example in my very first video in this series, and it's based on the subject of my dissertation, Rudolf Bultmann, who used to have his New Testament students over to his house, and they would read Greek from the New Testament and translate it into German. And every now and then a student would read a sentence and translate it into German, and Bultmann would say, yeah, your Greek is not so good. Is this theology it's not so good, right? Could be better, but not really bad. Let's take a closer look at this. Right? One of the first places you have to look when you're doing good theology is at history, right? How did we get to where we are? And the Feast of Christ the King is one of those things that's actually really easy to unearth what's going on because it's a fairly recent invention. Bolz-Weber is correct. 1925, we're not even at the century mark of this being a regular feast in the church somewhere on earth. So we can look back at 1925 and see what's going on. Now, some folks have looked at this and have said, but the Nazis weren't around until 1933. No, that's when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. The Nazis were around even at the time that Christ the King Sunday was made. But they were one of many groups of nationalists who argued that their problems were rooted in some other ethnic group or some other religion, and not in the fact that their country had lost a humiliating war and then been blamed for it, and then they just, had no job. In that case, Nazi ideology absolutely exists. And fascism is the more important one to look at here because fascism existed long before Nazism, right? Fascism is an Italian phenomenon, right? In fact, for a long time, the Nazis, well, you don't call us fascists. That's something they do in Italy, It took a while for Hitler to say, I guess we're kind of the same. We're better, but So fascism was around. Fascism's Mussolini. Fascism's going on in Italy at the time. But that's not really what Pope Pius XI was going after. It was not the only thing he was going after. He was going after something broader than that. There was nationalism in general, the assumption that a nation, a secular nation, can have the answers to life's problems because that was perceived as a threat to the church. And remember, the church, even then, it's only been a little while since the church has owned territory in a political sense. Right? Only at Vatican I in the 19th century did the church lose the papal states during the unification of Italy. And throughout the course of European history, the church and the Pope especially have fought over having jurisdiction in secular matters. There is still a sense that maybe the church should have some of this, but also a sense that if the church doesn't have this, they have very important spiritual power that the state cannot meet, that the state cannot use, that the state cannot help with. You have spiritual problems, the state can't fix those, but the church can. That's a big piece of what's going on in this. So yeah, fascism is in the sights there by virtue of being wrapped up in this whole way of looking at things outside of church solutions to life's problems. Nationalism itself feeds, is part of a bigger thing that the church is concerned about, secularism. Right? Secularism, there's an official definition and a working definition, right? That's the case of most things in the church. Officially, secularism is the idea that life's problems are purely the ones we can see. This life on this earth, what can be perceived with our senses, is all that there is, or at least all that there's worth worrying about. Right? This idea has grown over the centuries, and by the early 20th century, it was becoming understood that this might be the best route to go. Let everyone keep their personal religious beliefs to themselves and operate in a secular world. You can, whatever happens in the hereafter, that's between you and whatever God you have. But here on earth, we're going to just try to get through things. And the church, I think, rightly said that's a fairly short-sighted approach to things, because faith is about real life, and God's claims on us have things to do with real life. So the fight against secularism is rooted in this notion that the church has things that are important to say and has actions that are important to request of us in the here and now. We cannot assume that secular society can deal with all of our problems. That's the official approach to secularism. In practice, secularism means whatever we don't like. Secularism means things that many of which you and I would think of as perfectly normal and in fact would find alarming that the church was even suggesting we can't do. Christ the King Sunday exists in part against secularism. There aren't secular answers to your questions, there are religious answers. And secularism is things like women voting. Why would women vote? How could that possibly solve their problems? Only Jesus can. Why would anyone vote? Right? The church was not fond of democratic revolutions in European countries, thought the American system was very dangerous. France's republics were atheistic. The church hated democracy. The church loved monarchs because they propped them up. It was the old order when things were easier. Secularism is things like voting. Secularism is things like access to health care, access to birth control. All right? Now, there are people in our country today who would argue women should not have access to birth control. They should just not have sex, except with me. And they should not have abortions. They should just have their babies, but not expect me to pay for them. But the idea that women could have access to reproductive care, that would be considered secularism. Or arguing that you could have a social security net in place in a social welfare state, and instead of it depending on donations to the church to dole out to the poor. That would be considered secularism. Things that many of us would say that's a standard way of functioning as a human being in the 20th or 21st century. That's what the church was against. So the historical claim that Pius XI started Christ the King Sunday in opposition to fascism is incomplete. That's not the whole story. There were a lot of things that people like Bolz-Weber and myself value a great deal about our lives today that Christ the King Sunday would have stood in opposition to. It's also worth noting here that Christ the King Sunday was originally assigned to the last Sunday in October. Why the last Sunday in October? Why put it there? Well, that's when Lutherans and other Protestants remember Martin Luther and the Reformation. Tradition, the story is almost certainly not true, though there are people who claim to remember it, they're all dead, that Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the doors of Wittenberg's castle church on October 31st, 1517. Probably didn't. But that's about the time, and so that's the date we pick as the beginning of the Reformation and Reformation Day in Lutheran and other Protestant churches. The Sunday at the end of October is Reformation Sunday in the Protestant world. So Pius XI picks an anti-secular, anti-democratic, anti-reform holiday and slaps it in competition against Reformation Sunday. The feast was set up as anti-Lutheran Sunday, anti-Protestant Sunday. So not only is calling it opposed to fascism incomplete, it misses a major piece of it, which was it was not an ecumenical thing. It was very much a we're right, they're stupid approach to things. And in fact, I've had the experience as a supply preacher going into places where, in my mind, it was Christ the King Sunday on its new date at the very end of the liturgical year, the last Sunday, and placed there as a sign of ecumenical dialogue, right? The Roman Catholics moved it out of opposition to Reformation Day and put it in a new place at the end of the year where it could make a different claim that it had made in the 20s, where in its current location it claims at the end of all things Christ is still in charge, and we're not. And let's remember that. It's a powerful statement, and its theology has evolved over the nearly century that it's been there. But I would go into places with that in my mind and begin preaching about Christ the King and get these scowls from people. And not just because I was some 25-year-old guy barely holding back the swear words, but because I was calling it this feast, which was an anti-Lutheran thing. Christ the King is some random-ass Catholic thing, they would tell me. I didn't know this the first time that happened to me, and many of the generation that would have lived through that change is passing away. But there are still some who can remember that's definitely not something Lutherans do. It's an anti-Lutheran feast. It's not anymore. Today, Christ the King Sunday makes a claim that our claims to power are nothing compared to Christ's claim to authority over all of creation. But that's not why it was set up. The other problem that comes with Bolz-Weber's tweet here is calling it Antifa Sunday. Now, I want to preface this conversation by saying every Sunday is anti-fascism Sunday. All right? The crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ flies in the face of any claims by fascism or any ideology like it. Anything we thought God was going to be was brutally murdered by the state that we set up because it didn't match what we liked. And then it rose from the dead and disappeared from our grasp. God is beyond what we can control. God is beyond what we can know. We know what God has chosen to let us know, and that little bit is basically that God loves us and we should love one another. That flies in the face of fascist ideologies. So every Sunday is anti-fascism Sunday. Antifa is a phrase that in America especially has come to be understood incorrectly as some kind of terrorist organization. Right? Antifa is not even that well organized. And I would even say, I usually thought of it as being a leftist organization. I did not come up with this way of proving it's not, but I will quote it here. And I'm not sure who it was who came up with it, but I've heard it. You can tell that Antifa is not a leftist organization. How? If Antifa was a leftist organization, there would be about 25 different Antifas, and they'd all be fighting with each other instead of the fascists. That's what leftists do. So, and you say, well, that's a funny joke. No. That's like actually, trust me, okay? That's actually how you know. Antifa is assumed to be this terrorist organization, but Antifa is a very loosely organized group of anti-fascists who primarily attend any sort of protest where there is a chance that fascists or others on the far right will be present, and they counter whatever violent measures are taken. I know folks who've been involved in protests who do not identify as Antifa, or rather actually come afraid of them as they move about in their black outfits. But we're also grateful for them when, say, the Proud Boys began descending upon them, and suddenly there was this group of ninja warriors between them and the Proud Boys. Like, okay, this is all right. Sometimes Antifa has gotten violent. Usually it doesn't. A lot of times, Antifa is blamed for things that are clearly being done by other people, like the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. At noon that day, it was true patriots taking back their country. By about 3 p.m., when it became apparent that they were not going to succeed at this, people began distancing themselves from the insurrection and claiming it was actually an Antifa false flag operation. Draw attention away, blame the right for this thing that the deep state was doing to us. That's what we like to call bullshit, gaslighting, wrong. No, this was far-right protesters at the Capitol that day. But by using the term Antifa without really explaining it, Bolz-Weber can really isolate a lot of people with this claim, right? I know that Antifa is not a far-left radical terrorist organization that plants false flag operations and tries to pin violence on good, God-fearing, hardline right-wingers who showed up with bombs and zip ties and other things, but just to protect themselves from that scary Antifa person. I know that's not what happened, all right? We also live in a world where a lot of people believe that. And so we need to be prepared to explain what we mean by Antifa. Tweets don't create enough space to do that. It's the biggest problem I have with tweets. Even when they expanded them from 140 characters to 280, it's still not enough room to explain what on earth you're talking about. Twitter, most social media, are not designed for conversation. They're designed for yelling at each other. That's what happens. By not defining Antifa, though, this tweet suggests to those who aren't sure or lean to the right on matters of what group was causing trouble at the protest, to suggest that the ELCA's public theologian is just embracing typical leftist communist thought. Now, while for some of us that wouldn't be a problem, it's also not true. Bolz-Weber is trying to make a very clear theological claim that Christ the King Sunday declares that Jesus Christ is the true authority in this world, and that ideologies like fascism, like Christian nationalism, like American exceptionalism, and others that claim to have the solutions to our problems are really just temporary, and not only they're temporary, they're also diametrically opposed to the Christ who was crucified, died, and rose from the dead and pours his life out for all of us. They simply contradict what everything Jesus was about and everything the New Testament's about. Even the parts that you like to claim aren't about it. We like to pick on Paul and saying he's this horrible guy. Dude, our theology is Pauline, and Paul says Jesus died at the hands of the Romans and rose from the dead so that we can all live together with Jesus now, being good to one another. There's no room in that way of thinking for fascism. So is Bolz-Weber's claim bad theology? I don't know who's being hurt by this. Obviously, if you believe Antifa is a terrorist organization, you might think, well, the ELCA has nothing to tell me. They're just another leftist organization. Maybe that is hurtful. I know that in this day and age, it's also very difficult to communicate with anybody. And there are an awful lot of folks whose idea of communication is that those of us who don't hate the people they hate need to learn that it's okay that they hate the people they hate, and that they're mistreating them, oppressing them, hurting them is actually perfectly fine. That's not where we're going to go. It's not where I'm going to go. I do not think that the solution to our problems is to give more room and more understanding to oppressors. So maybe there is no other way to open the conversation but to go ahead and take the stand you want to take. Not knowing, I'm not going to call it bad theology. I'm going to say maybe the theology here is not so good. Could have been clearer. Could have been better. One thing I will say, though, is that Bolz-Weber, in her job as the ELCA's public theologian, got people talking about a liturgical holiday. As somebody who studies the liturgy, who writes about the liturgy, and whose favorite thing about being a pastor is doing liturgy, that was exciting. We've had conversations about what the meaning of a liturgical feast is, and it's not even Christmas or Easter, and people who normally weren't talking about this, wouldn't be caught dead talking about this, talked about it a lot. That's a really good thing. So while the theology might have been not so good, I think the outcome was excellent. So no, I don't think this was bad theology. I think it could have been done a little better, but it got a really good result. Happy Christ the King Sunday, or whenever you're catching this video.